The announcement came on a Tuesday at 9:03 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The sky over Detroit was a flat, indifferent gray. Coffee was brewing in countless kitchens. Commuters were still inching their way through the morning crawl. Then, the news alerts began to chime, heralding an event so monumental, so utterly unthinkable, that many initially dismissed it as a hoax. General Motors, the colossus of American industry, was ceasing operations, indefinitely. The words hung in the air, heavy, unbelievable, a death knell for an era. Disbelief was the first wave. It crashed over the nation, then the globe. General Motors, shutting down? It was like saying the sun had decided not to rise. This wasn't just a company, it was an institution, woven into the very fabric of American identity. The initial reports were sparse, almost clinical, which only amplified the sense of surreal dread. Financial markets reacted with predictable panic, but even the algorithms seemed to pause, as if to ask, is this real? The silence from GM headquarters in those initial hours was deafening, a vacuum into which fear and speculation rushed with terrifying speed. The president was scheduled to address the nation. Governors of affected states convened emergency meetings. The directive, when it finally filtered down from the stunned silence of corporate offices to the roaring heart of production, was brutally simple. Cease all operations, tools down, power off. One by one the assembly lines began to slow, then stutter, then stop. An eerie silence descended upon the factory floors. Conveyor belts laden with half-finished vehicles now stood frozen, monuments to an abruptly terminated ambition. For the workers the news was a body blow. Many had heard the rumors, but few had truly believed it could come to this. Generations of families had poured their lives into these factories. There was shock, then a rising tide of anger, quickly followed by a profound, gut-wrenching despair. Husbands and wives who worked side by side looked at each other, the unspoken question of what now, hanging heavy between them. The shutdown was not a contained explosion. It was the epicenter of an economic earthquake. For every GM plant that fell silent, a constellation of suppliers felt the tremors almost instantaneously. Orders vanished into thin air. Contracts became worthless pieces of paper. The broader economy reeled. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted, shedding points with alarming velocity. As the initial shock began to subside, the question on everyone's lips was how? How could a titan like General Motors simply cease to be? The answers were complex, tangled, and deeply rooted in decisions made far from the factory floor, in the corridors of power where trade policy is forged. The preceding years had been marked by a volatile trade environment. Tariffs, once a relatively obscure tool of economic statecraft, had become front-page news. For a global manufacturer like GM, this new era of protectionism was a minefield. The cost of raw materials soared, squeezing margins and clouding future investment decisions. The collapse of General Motors was not just an economic statistic, it was a deeply personal tragedy, multiplied hundreds of thousands of times over. In towns across the American Midwest and beyond, communities faced a terrifyingly uncertain future. Generations had punched the clock, raised families and built lives around the steady rhythm of the assembly line. Now, that rhythm had stopped, and the silence was deafening. Local diners saw their tables empty. Hardware stores, car dealerships, small-town banks braced for a downturn. The social fabric, woven tight by shared employment and community pride, began to fray. The loss was more than just jobs. It was the loss of identity, of purpose, of a shared future. Beyond the immediate economic carnage, the collapse of General Motors cast a long, dark shadow over the shift to electric vehicles. GM had positioned itself as a leader in this automotive revolution. Billions had been invested. Ambitious timelines had been set. Now, that dream lay shattered, a casualty of the wider collapse. The gleaming new EV assembly plants stood silent, their state-of-the-art robotics idle. For a nation striving to compete in the global EV market, the sudden removal of a domestic giant like GM was a catastrophic setback. The vision of a cleaner, electrified transportation future suddenly appeared more distant, more difficult to achieve.